We went through, if you remember, we've been going through the railroads of, now that we're down to six really railroads in North America, big ones. And we've gone through we're going through the Burlington Northern Santa Fe because that was the first one, alphabetically. And we went through the Burlington, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and the the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. And so now we're going to talk about the merger that happened in 1970 when the Burlington Northern first merged. And it took 70 years for this to happen, because Jim Hill merged them back in 1900, but it was taken apart. We'll do a comparison of the railroads and components of the Burlington Northern in 1950 and how it compares when they put it together. So again, the Burlington always advertised itself as 11,000 miles everywhere west. And if the Burlington and the CNS together, that was 11,000 route miles. And they had a total of 19,000 million ton miles, 19 billion ton miles. So the Burlington and the Great Northern are about the same size. Northern Pacific was a little bit smaller, but together, the Burlington Northern in 1970 was 27,000 miles, made about $700 million if you total it up from in 1950 dollars. And they had about 48,000 million ton miles. So it was the biggest railroad in North America at that time. In terms of back in 1950, they were all about half steam, half diesel in terms of the ton miles hauled. There were some more steam engines, and of course it took multiple units, but the diesels were on the road a lot more. As we talked about, when the F units got to one end of the line, they
gas them up and
fuel them, check the oil, and turn them around. When the steam engine got to the end of the line, which would be 500 miles or 1,000 miles or maybe a couple thousand miles, they'd have to go in the shop for a day or two. So the diesels had much higher availability. But by in 1970, the BN had a couple thousand locomotives and still some passenger cars. So as I said, James J. Hill merged it he created a trust in the Northern Securities Company Trust, and he put the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Burlington, and SP&S in there. And he had the backing of J.P. Morgan, and Harriman from the UP was actually on the board of the Burlington because he had gotten on the board of the Burlington. He wanted to buy the Burlington, but Jim Hill had won out on that one. And this is a cartoon from the late 1800s, and the robber barons were just going crazy. I mean, they were just they were huge corporations and monopolies. And so here are the robber barons. And then here's the congressman sitting in front. And so it led to the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. And that was an act to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies. And this was a major piece of legislation, and it passed both houses, the House and the Senate unanimously.
Wow.
Oh yeah, if you can imagine anything passing unanimously. But
that's
the
what
robber
barons, everybody is fed up, right?
Yeah, the robber barons had just gone nuts. And so Teddy Roosevelt went after a whole bunch of these large companies. And so he went after the Great Northern, and he went to court and he won. They took it to Jim Hill took it to the appellate court, and Teddy Roosevelt won there, and he took it all the way to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, nope, you have to break it up. So they did. They broke it up. Harriman had put the UP and the SP together. Here's the UP and the SP into a trust, and they broke that up. And the difference between 1900 and 1990, when they finally did merge again, is that in 1900 the railroads had over 90% of the freight business. By 1999, it was probably down to a third. So it wasn't such a monopoly. And Standard Oil was a big one. We'll talk about that for a minute because I was a little shocked how big that was. And then there were a total of 44 other trusts that were broken up. Now, the biggest one, John D. Rockefeller, created Standard Oil. He would just go in to an area and he would drop prices, and so he'd run the refiners and the producers out of business. Then they were bankrupt, and then he'd buy their businesses for 25, 30 cents on the dollar. And he had 3/4 of the oil business in the United States in 1911. So you can imagine 3/4 of it. That is a monopoly. And of course, they were tied intimately with oil was tied intimately with the railroads because they didn't have pipelines. So there are thousands, tens of thousands of oil tank cars running around. Now, these are all the companies that were part of Standard Oil. I was really shocked at this.
Yeah.
So these are when they broke it up into all these different pieces. Saucony, it used to be Saucony Mobile, and Saucony stands for Standard Oil Company of New York. And that became Mobil, and then Mobil merged with Esso to become Exxon. Esso, which also had the overseas subsidiary and subsidiary in Canada, is Eastern States Standard Oil, and that's Standard Oil of New Jersey. And then the Standard that we saw in the Midwest, that's Standard Oil of Indiana.
Indiana, right.
And then they became Amoco, and then later they called it Amoco. Now it's owned by British Petroleum.
In Ohio, it was called Sohio.
Yeah, there were actually two companies in Ohio. They broke up. Ohio was so big. Conoco was Continental Oil Company. Calso was California Standard Oil, and that became Chevron. There was Kentucky Standard Oil that became part of Chevron later. Here's Sohio, just what you talked about. But there was also the Ohio Oil Company. So there was so much oil activity in Ohio because, of course, it's a big state, and there were oil producers as well as users with the industry. And the Ohio Oil Company became Marathon. And then there was Pennsylvania Oil, which became Pennzoil. So, I mean, a lot of companies. And so they broke Standard Oil up into all these different companies.
Well, the Esso brand still lives in Canada.
Yes. And I think that's total. I think they had to separate it. I don't think that's part of any of the other Standard Oils.
I believe you're right.
Yeah, it's a separate company. Another way they were tied intimately. All these big businesses were tied together. But William Rockefeller, the brother of John D. Rockefeller, he bought Anaconda Copper in Butte, and he wanted a third railroad to the Puget Sound. Because there was Northern Pacific and Great Northern, but those were almost acting like one. So he was really the impetus behind the Milwaukee building the line to the Pacific. Really? He actually financed it. Unfortunately, he financed it. He didn't give them the money. He financed it. And so they originally looked at building it, and it was they thought it was going to cost about $60 million. Well, it cost $260 million by the time they built it. And so they had this huge debt, and they went bankrupt a number of times. And of course, when the BN merged, they got some concessions, but by then the track was so bad that ultimately they shut it down in the 70s. So they tried, Great Northern, Northern Pacific tried again in 1927. And then in 1955, they got going on. Hired this company called Haley Dick and Company. And they did a study, and that's when they came up with the proposal to create the Great Northern Pacific and Burlington lines.
Yeah.
and which is kind of a clever name, but it's a little long. But anyway, so they identified 46 million in savings. And so they went to the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it was rejected. And so then they worked with the Milwaukee Road, and Milwaukee got 11 gateways on the West Coast. They worked with the unions, and so they got rid of all the opposition by 1970. And so they applied in 1967, and then it went through the year, and then finally They went to court because there was still opposition, and finally the Supreme Court said, yes, you can merge in 1970. So early in 1970, they finally did merge. And of course, here's the map with the Great Northern up here, the Northern Pacific, and then all the Burlington lines. And
So really off the wall question.
sure.
What is the overall reason for these mergers? Was it strictly financial?
Yes, yeah, because
Okay.
if you look at this, this doesn't show all the duplicate trackage.
No,
There's
no.
a lot of
okay.
savings by and the other thing is to be able to have one railroad from Chicago to Seattle, so that you
Right.
don't have to have transfers. And it's basically and savings in terms of having a better financial power. And they did cut a lot of. They were able to cut some jobs, reduce shops, and reduce the number of yards, and just make the whole operation more economical. And
Okay.
the Burlington Northern Merger was pretty good, and they learned a lot from the a couple of years before the Penn Central had merged, and that was a disaster, where the two companies, the Pennsylvania and New York Central, fought each other, and if you have employees fighting each other, everybody's going to lose. So that was not good.